My wife smiled as her daughter pointed at me and said, "You're a parasite. You live here off others." I slowly stood up, took the house keys from my pocket, placed them on the table, and said, "Good luck now you can pay the mortgage, the kids' tuition, and health insurance yourselves." Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. It was a Sunday. The table was full. There was hot food, glasses with soda, the sound of silverware clashing against the plates, the mixed voices of the whole family gathered. Aurora, Raquel's mother, was sitting at the center. Jamie, her brother, was laughing loudly as always. Emilio, my stepson, was looking at his phone, and Raquel, my wife, was right in front of me with that smile it had taken me so long to earn years ago. Everything seemed normal until Lorena stood up. She stood up slowly, like someone who has something prepared. She stared at me, and with her finger pointing right at me in front of everyone, she said something I'll never forget. She said, "You're a parasite. You live here out of charity." The noise at the table stopped. Everyone looked at me. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes on me. And then, in that painful silence, I turned to look at Raquel, my wife, the woman I slept with every night, with whom I had built a life, with whom I had signed papers, paid bills, supported an entire house. Raquel looked at me and laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It wasn't an uncomfortable laugh. It was a real laugh, short but real, as if what her daughter had just said was somehow funny, as if I were, in fact, the joke of the afternoon. Nobody said anything. Nobody corrected her. Nobody set a boundary, and at that moment something inside me settled into place. It wasn't anger, wasn't tears. It was something much colder. It was clarity. I sat there for a few more seconds, took a breath, reached into my pants pocket, took out the house keys, that keychain I carried every day for more than 8 years, and I put them on the table, slowly, without drama, without raising my voice. The sound of the metal against the wood was the only thing that was heard. I looked at all of them and said, "Good luck. Now you pay the mortgage, Emilio's school, and health plan." Nobody understood at that moment what that meant. But they were going to understand. Oh, they were going to understand. Let me tell you from the beginning, because this story didn't start that Sunday. It started much earlier. It started the day I decided to love a family that never saw me as a part of it. And it took me too long to realize something that now seems so obvious, that when someone shows you who they are, you have to believe them. My name's Joel. I'm 47, and for more than 8 years, I was the invisible man in that house. Invisible, but necessary, very necessary. I met Raquel during a difficult time in my life. I had just closed a small business I had. I had been through complicated months and was rebuilding everything from scratch. She was a woman with 2 children, recently separated, with an energy that enveloped you without you realizing it. From the first time I saw her, I knew she was the kind of person who filled spaces, that wherever she entered the room changed. I fell in love fast, maybe too fast. Lorena was 22 when I met her. She was already an adult, her character already formed, and from the first day, she made it clear I was an intruder, not with words at first, with gestures, with silences, with that way of speaking to her mother, as if I weren't in the room. Emilio was younger, quieter, and although he never called me dad or anything like it, at least he didn't treat me like I was a nuisance. Raquel told me to give Lorena time, that it was hard for her to see her mother with someone new, that she would change. And I, who wanted to believe her, who wanted it to work, I gave her time, I gave her years. But Lorena didn't change. She changed for the worse. As the years went by, and I became more integrated into that house, she became more hostile, as if everything I did well was a personal affront, as if the fact that I was there present, stable, was something she couldn't tolerate. And Raquel saw it. She saw it and said nothing, or said the minimum, enough to calm the situation, but never enough to make it clear whose side she was on. I worked a lot. I have a small industrial maintenance services company, nothing glamorous but solid. During those 8 years, I built something that allowed me to support a whole life. Not just mine, everyone's. The mortgage on that house, the house where the 4 of us lived, was in my name. I had gotten it. I had made the down payment. I'd been paying the $200 monthly for 6 years. Raquel worked? Yes, but her salary barely covered the grocery expenses and some personal things. The real weight of that house, I carried it. Emilio's school, a private high school he himself had asked for because his friends went there, cost $800 a month. I paid it without saying a word because Emilio was a good kid and I didn't want him to suffer because of the problems between his sister and me. The family health plan that covered Raquel, Lorena, and Emilio came out of my payroll every month. 50. Automatic silent. The car Lorena used to go to work every day, that car she drove as if it were hers, as if it had always been hers, was financed in my name. $190 a month. I paid them because when Raquel asked me for the favor 3 years ago, I said yes because back then I still believe that's how you showed love, by giving, always giving. Nobody at that table that Sunday knew all that clearly. Or maybe they did and had simply decided not to see it. Which is sometimes the same thing, because when you give in silence for a long time, people end up believing that things just arrive on their own, that the lights pay for themselves, that food appears on its own, that the house maintains itself. And when someone lives convinced of that, it's very easy to point a finger at the one who has always been there and call them a parasite. Very easy. But that Sunday, when I put the keys on the table and said those words, something had changed forever. Not in them yet, not in me, because I had already made a decision before sitting down at that table. A decision I wasn't going to announce, that I wasn't going to discuss, that I wasn't going to explain. I was just going to let reality do its job. And when reality arrives, it doesn't ask for permission. I got up from that table without rushing, without slamming doors, without dramatic looks. I pushed the chair in carefully, as I always did, as if it were any other Sunday, and I had simply finished eating. I folded the napkin and put it next to the plate and walked towards the hallway, without looking back. I heard Jamie say something in a low voice. I heard Aurora clear her throat. I heard Lorena let out a short laugh, one of those that means see. He can't even defend himself. And above all, I heard Raquel's silence. That silence I already knew well, the silence she used when she didn't want to take sides, when she preferred for things to resolve themselves, when she chose her comfort over anything else. I went into the room, closed the door without slamming it, sat on the edge of the bed and stayed like that, still, looking at the floor for a few minutes. I wasn't trembling, I didn't feel like crying, I was calm in a way that surprised even me. It was the calmness of someone who has already made a decision and knows there's no turning back. I grabbed my phone and checked some work messages. I answered 2 emails I had pending. Then I turned it off, put on the nightstand, and lay back for a moment with my eyes open looking at the ceiling. I thought about everything I had built in those 8 years, not what I had received, what I had built, because that's the difference no one sees from the outside. You could be in a relationship and give a lot. And if what you give isn't named, isn't thanked, isn't acknowledged, over time it becomes invisible. And when something is invisible, people start to believe it doesn't exist. That's what happened in that house. I became invisible, but everything I supported was still very real. Outside, I heard the conversation at the table liven up again. The voices rose again. Someone put on music. I heard Lorena laughing at something with Jamie, as if nothing had happened, as if what she had just done humiliating me in front of the whole family was just another Sunday anecdote. And maybe for them it was. For me, it was the last one. Raquel came into the room about 40 minutes later. She opened the door slowly, as if she wasn't sure what she was going to find on the other side. She saw me lying down and stood in the doorway for a moment. I said, I didn't answer right away. I let her talk. Lorena didn't mean to say it like that. She said, you know how she is. She has a loose tongue. I remained silent. Don't be like that, she continued. The family is leaving now. Why don't you come out and we'll have a coffee? I looked her in the eyes, slowly, without anger, without exaggerated harshness. I just looked at her like someone looking at something they're trying to fully understand. Okay, I told her and I got up. Raquel smiled relieved. That was the me, the one she knew, the one who didn't make waves, the one who let things go, the one who preferred peace to being right. What she didn't know is that afternoon, I wasn't letting anything go. I was observing, I was counting, I was finishing confirming something I'd known for a while, but that on that Sunday became completely clear to me. I went out into the hallway, greeted Aurora with a nod when she said goodbye. I shook Jamie's hand without saying much, and when Lorena passed by me on her way to the door, she glanced at me with that expression she had, that mix of defiance and self-satisfaction, and I simply nodded my head without irony, without tension. I just nodded like someone closing a chapter. She didn't understand that gesture. Not yet. That night, when Raquel fell asleep, I stayed awake. Not out of anguish, out of clarity. Because I had many things in order in my head, and I wanted to make sure everything was well thought out before taking the next step. I reviewed every number, every contract, every account. The mortgage, $3, $200 a month in my name. With my credit history. With my signature. Raquel had never participated in that process. When we bought the house, she had outstanding debts, and the bank didn't approve her. I was the title holder. I was always the title holder. Emilio's school, $800 a month. Automatic charge to my card. The contract was signed by me. If that charge stopped, the school would directly notify the contact number they had on file. Mine, the health plan for $150 a month, automatically deducted from my account on the first of every month. If I cancel that plan, the coverage would be cut off within 30 days, no exceptions. The financing for Lorena's car, $10 a month in my name. If the payments stopped, the vehicle repossession process would begin in 90 days. Lorena knew nothing about that. Raquel knew it vaguely, but she had never cared to understand the details because I had always handled the details. And then there were the things that didn't have an exact number, but that also supported that house, the repairs I did or had done, the plumber I called when something went wrong, the air conditioning technician who had my number saved, the trusted neighbor who would let me know if something happened when I traveled for work. The entire network of small things that kept that house running, and that only existed because I had built them with years of silent tension. All of that was what Lorena called a parasite. I wondered, lying in that darkness, if she knew. If she said it knowing the truth and choosing to ignore it, or if she genuinely believed I contributed nothing. And I came to the conclusion that it didn't matter, that in either case the result was the same. A person who looks you in the eyes in front of your family and tells you you're worthless either knows perfectly well what you're doing and despises it, or doesn't know because they never bother to find out. In both cases, the problem wasn't Lorena. The problem was that Raquel had laughed. That's what I couldn't get out of my head. Not Lorena's cruelty, which I already knew, but Raquel's laugh, short, almost involuntary, but real, and the silence that followed. That silence that lasted too long. That lasted long enough for me to understand that no correction was coming. No, hey, don't talk to him like that. No gesture from her that would put things in their place. Nothing, just the laugh and the silence. And there I was, sitting at that table I had bought, in that house whose mortgage I paid, eating on plates I had brought, breathing the fresh air from an air conditioner whose maintenance I paid. Being called a parasite. There are moments in life when you understand that the problem isn't what just happened. The problem is everything you let happen before to get there. Every time Lorena made a comment and I stayed quiet. Every time Raquel downplayed something that hurt me. Every time I put the peace of that house above my own respect. Every time I chose to give more instead of asking for the basics. All of that had brought me to that Sunday, and that Sunday was telling me with a clarity that allowed no interpretation that it was enough. The next morning, I got up early before everyone else. I made myself a coffee, drank it standing in the kitchen, looking out the window at the garden that I also maintained. Then I grabbed my phone and dialed the number of a contact I had saved for a while. A lawyer, a man I had spoken with briefly months ago in a conversation that at the time went nowhere, but that I hadn't forgotten. I told him I needed an appointment, that it was urgent, that I wanted to understand exactly what my rights and options were. He gave me an appointment for Wednesday. I hung up the phone, finished my coffee, washed the cup, and put it to dry. And when Raquel came down 20 minutes later, sleepy, asking me to make her another coffee as she always did, I made it without drama, without noticeable distance, with the same calm as always, because it wasn't time yet. But the time was coming. The days that followed that Sunday were strangely normal, at least on the surface. Raquel would get up, have breakfast, go to work. Emilio would leave for school. Lorena would show up at the house whenever she wanted, grab the car without saying anything, come back whenever she felt like it, and I was still there in my usual routine, leaving early, working, coming home, having dinner with whoever was there, sleeping, repeating. Nobody noticed anything different. That was exactly what I wanted, because while everything seemed the same on the outside, on the inside, I was doing something I'd never done in 8 years of marriage. I was putting everything in order. I was reviewing every paper, every contract, every account, every obligation that bore my name, and I was making decisions, one by one, with the calm coldness of someone who has nothing left to lose because they already understood what they really had. On Wednesday, I arrived at the lawyer's office on time. His name was Emilio, curiously, same as my Jastro, though they were nothing alike. He was a man of about 55, serious, direct, the kind who doesn't waste time beating around the bush. He listened to me without interrupting for almost 20 minutes while I explained the situation. The house, the accounts, the car financing, the health plan, the school, everything. When I finished, he looked at me for a moment and said, "You have more control than you think." I kept that phrase. He explained clearly what I already suspected, but needed to hear from someone who understood the law. The house was in my name. As the sole holder of the mortgage, I had very clear rights to that property. Raquel lived there, yes, but her name didn't appear on the original contract. That had important implications if I decided to make changes. Lorena's car was even simpler. It was financed in my name. If I stopped paying, the process was automatic. The bank wouldn't ask Lorena anything. They'd ask me. The health plan could be canceled with a 30-day notice. Emilio's school the same. Everything had my details as the holder, my signature as the responsible party, my account as the source of payment. "What do you want to do?" the lawyer asked me. I told him I wasn't sure about the details yet, but I wanted to know exactly what would happen if I stopped supporting each of those things. I wanted the full map before moving a single piece. He gave it to me. I left that office with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't revenge. It was something more like the feeling of standing on solid ground after walking for years on something that was moving. That same afternoon, on my way home, I stopped at a coffee shop and sat alone for a while. I ordered a coffee and took out a small notebook I carried for work. I wrote everything down, everything I supported, every amount, every due date, every step I was going to take, and in what order. I wasn't going to do everything at once. That would have been a mistake. Doing everything at once would have seemed like an emotional reaction, and I didn't want to react. I wanted to act. There's a huge difference between the two things. Whoever reacts does it from pain. Whoever acts does it from a decision. I had decided. The first thing I did, almost without anyone noticing, was talk to the institution where Emilio studied. I called on a Thursday morning from the car before going into a work meeting. I spoke with the administrative area and informed them that due to changes in my financial situation, the automatic charge they had on file might be affected in the coming weeks. I asked them to contact me directly at the number they had on file if there was any problem with the payment. They assured me they would. I hung up. I went on with my day. Nobody at home knew about that call. The second thing I did was review the health plan contract. I went to the insurer's website, reviewed the terms, confirmed the deadlines. Everything was as the lawyer had explained. 30 days notice to cancel. Simple procedure, no complications. I left it there for the moment. I didn't cancel anything yet. I just wanted to have the path laid out. The third thing was more personal. One afternoon, when Raquel came home late from work and Lorena wasn't home, I sat with Emilio in the living room. He was watching something on his phone. I sat next to him and we were silent for a while. Then I asked him how school was going. He said fine, that he had a test next week. I told him to study, that it was the most important thing he could do right now. He looked at me for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, and then went back to his phone. Emilio wasn't a bad kid. He never really had been. He was young, a little lost, very influenced by his sister. But deep down, he didn't have the same cruelty as Lorena. I knew that, and it made some things harder. But I had also learned in those days that compassion couldn't continue to be the reason I stayed trapped. I could have compassion and still make decisions. The two things could exist at the same time. That night, when Raquel got in the shower. I stayed in bed checking my phone. I had a message from my brother who lived in another city and with whom I spoke little but well. He asked how I was. I replied that I was fine, that I was sorting some things out that I'd tell him later. I didn't tell him yet. It wasn't time to tell anyone yet. What I did do that week was started discreetly organize my personal things. No suitcases, nothing visible. I just started identifying what was mine and what wasn't. Important documents, I gradually moved to a folder that I kept in the office. Things of sentimental value, some photographs, objects that mattered to me, I put them in an accessible place. Not because I was planning to leave that week, but because I wanted to be ready when the time came. And the time, I knew, wouldn't be long. Raquel, throughout those days, behaved as if that Sunday hadn't happened. That was her way of handling difficult things, ignoring them until they disappeared. She spoke to me normally. She asked me for things normally. She laughed at things on TV. She told me stories from work. Everything normal. Everything as always. One night, she asked if we could go out on the weekend, that she felt like going out to dinner somewhere. I told her I'd see how work was. She smiled and continued watching television. I kept staring at the screen without seeing anything, thinking about her smile, about how easy it was for her to move from one moment to the next without carrying anything, without processing anything, as if the things that happened in that house had no real weight, left no mark, meant nothing beyond the moment they occurred. And I understood something important that night, something it took me too long to see. Raquel wasn't a bad person, but she was a person who had learned that the consequences of her choices were always absorbed by someone else. There was always someone, me, who took the hit, who paid the bill, who solved the problem, who softened the blow. And as long as that continued to be the case, she would never change. Not because she couldn't, but because she had no reason to. That reason was about to appear. On the Friday of that week, when I got home from work, Lorena was in the kitchen. She saw me come in, looked at me for a second, and continued doing what she was doing without saying anything. Not hello or anything. I left the keys in the usual drawer, poured myself a glass of water, and went to the living room. Those keys I had put on the table on Sunday were already back in my pocket. Nobody had asked anything about it. Nobody had said anything about that moment, as if they had also decided to erase it. Perfect. Because I hadn't erased it. I had it very present, and I was going to have it present every morning I got up from that Sunday, until everything I had silently supported for 8 years was completely exposed. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to threaten. I wasn't going to ask for explanations, or apologies, or midnight conversations. I was just going to stop supporting and wait for gravity to do its job. The first Monday of the following month arrived without any announcements, as days that change everything always do, disguised as normalcy. I got up early, made my coffee, checked my phone, and before leaving for work, I did something very simple. I went into the bank's app, found the automatic charge for Emilio's school, and canceled it. $800 a month canceled. I didn't call the school. I didn't tell anyone at home. I didn't say anything. I went on with my day. That same afternoon, I went to the insurer's website and submitted the formal request to cancel the family health plan. Just as the lawyer had explained, the coverage would continue for 30 more days from that date. After that, it would cut off on its own, without drama, without confrontation, just an administrative process that I had initiated from a screen in silence while outside the sun was still high. 2 moves. Nobody saw them, nobody felt them yet, but they were already made. What followed were seemingly calm days. The house functioned the same. Raquel would get up and go to work. Emilio would leave for school without knowing anything yet. Lorena would use the car, come back, lock herself in her room. I would arrive, have dinner, sleep. Everything the same, until it wasn't. The first notice arrived on a Thursday. It was almost 11 in the morning, and I was in a work meeting when I saw I had a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. During the break, I looked it up, and it was from the administration of Emilio's school. I called them back from the car, with the window open, taking the last sip of a coffee that was already cold. The lady who answered was polite, but direct. She informed me that the month's automatic charge hadn't gone through, that they had a 10-day grace period before the situation would affect the student's enrollment, that if there was a problem, they could discuss options. I told her I understood that I was reviewing my personal finances, that I would let them know before the deadline. She thanked me for the call and hung up. I put my phone away, started the car, and went back to work. I didn't call Raquel. I didn't mention anything to Emilio. I didn't do anything. I just waited. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, Emilio came down to breakfast with a strange expression. He poured himself cereal, sat down, and stared at his bowl for a while without eating. Raquel hadn't come down yet. Lorena never had breakfast with us. It was just him and me in the kitchen. I asked if he was okay. He said yes, that he was just tired, but I knew that wasn't it, because I saw he had his phone face down on the table. What do people do when they don't want you to see their notifications? I didn't ask any more. Later that same day, I heard Emilio and Raquel talking in low voices in the hallway. I couldn't hear everything, but I did catch Emilio saying something about the school, about a notice, about a payment. And I heard Raquel telling him not to worry, that it was probably a mistake, that she would sort it out. I stayed where I was reading without moving. Raquel didn't sort it out that day or the next, because Raquel didn't have access to the accounts that paid for that school. She never had, because she never needed it. It had always been automatic. It had always been invisible. It had always been me. The following Wednesday, with exactly 2 days left before the school's grace period expired, Raquel came to find me in the room. She entered with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression she wore when she needed something, but didn't want to ask for it directly. A mix of calculated sweetness and barely concealed tension. She sat on the edge of the bed where I was reading and told me she had received a message from Emilio's school that apparently the month's payment hadn't gone through. If I could check it. I looked at her over my book. I already saw it, I said. She waited for me to continue. I didn't continue, and she said, "Finally, I'm reorganizing my expenses." I said, "Simple, no drama, no further explanation." Raquel frowned slightly. "Joel, it's Emilio's school. I know. He can't be left without school." I didn't say he was going to be left without school. I said I'm reorganizing my expenses. There was a silence. She looked at me, searching for something in my face. Some sign that this was a normal conversation, that there was a simple and quick solution. But she didn't find what she was looking for. "Are you okay?" she asked me. "Perfectly," I said, and went back to my book. She sat there a moment longer, uncomfortable, not sure what to say. Then she got up and left the room without another word. We didn't talk while falling asleep that night, as we sometimes did, each on their own side of the bed, in silence. And I, looking at the ceiling in the darkness, felt something I hadn't felt in a long time inside that house. I felt I had control, not of her, not of the situation, of myself, of my decisions, of what was going to happen next. And that, after 8 years of feeling invisible, of feeling like the one holding everything up from below without anyone looking down, was a feeling that was priceless. On Friday, punctual as a clock, the school called again. This time they didn't call me. They sent a direct message to Raquel because she was listed as a secondary contact in Emilio's file. The message was clear. If the payment wasn't regularized by Monday, Emilio couldn't continue attending until the situation was resolved. That afternoon, the house had a different energy. Raquel was tense, moving from one side to the other, constantly checking her phone. Emilio was locked in his room. Even Lorena, who usually arrived and settled in the living room as if it were her personal territory, was quieter than usual that afternoon. I got home from work, left the keys in the drawer, poured myself some water, and sat in the living room to check some pending emails. Lorena was there on her usual armchair. She looked at me when I came in, but said nothing. Neither did I. We were in the same space for a while without speaking, which was nothing new. But that afternoon, there was something different in her silence. It wasn't the usual arrogant silence. It was a silence that was looking for something, as if she were calibrating, measuring, trying to understand what was happening without having to ask directly. I gave her nothing she could use. Raquel sought me out after dinner. She said we needed to talk. I said sure when she wanted. She said now we sat in the kitchen, just the two of us. with a cup of tea that neither of us touched. She explained the school situation as if I didn't know. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her how much she had saved. She was silent. I asked if she could cover this month's payment. Another silence. I don't have that money available right now. She finally said, how much do you have available? I doubt like $200, maybe a little more. I nodded slowly. I understand, Joel. I need you to help me with this. I looked at her. I looked at her the same way she had looked at me that Sunday at the table, without looking away, without changing my expression. Raquel, I said calmly, a few weeks ago, I sat at that table in my house, and your daughter called me a parasite in front of your whole family, and you laughed. The color of her face changed. That has nothing to do with it, she said. It has everything to do with it, I replied. Because that day, I understood something. I understood that you've been living in this house for years without really knowing who supports it. And I thought it was time you found out. Raquel opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Are you saying you're not going to pay for Emilio's school because of what Lorena said? I'm saying I'm reorganizing my expenses. I repeated, and if anyone in this house wants to talk about what each person contributes and what each person deserves, I'm completely available for that conversation. The silence that followed was the longest of that whole week, and in that silence, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fill it. Raquel didn't sleep well that night. I knew because I heard her move, toss, and turn, get up once for water, and come back. I lay still on my side of the bed, breathing slowly with my eyes closed, although I wasn't asleep, thinking, organizing, calculating what was coming. She never imagined I could be that man, the one who doesn't give in, who doesn't soften things, who doesn't show up with a solution the next day so that everything goes back to normal. Because in 8 years, I had always been the other one, the one who absorbed, the one who solved, the one who preferred peace to being right. But the peace I had maintained for 8 years hadn't been free. It had come at a huge cost, a cost I had paid alone in silence, without anyone asking me or thanking me for it. And that cost was called my own respect. Monday came, and Emilio didn't go to school. Nobody told me directly. I knew because at the time he'd normally be gone. He was still in his room. I heard him moving upstairs when I was finishing my coffee. Raquel had already left for work, early without waking me up to say goodbye, as she always did. That was new, too. I went down, had breakfast, washed my plate, and before leaving, I went up to knock on Emilio's room door. He told me to come in. He was sitting at his desk looking at the computer screen without doing anything in particular. He looked like he hadn't slept well. I asked how he was. He said fine with that way of saying fine that means the opposite. I told him if he needed to talk. I was here, that he didn't have to solve everything alone. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, without saying anything else. I left, closed the door carefully, and went to work. It wasn't cruelty I felt towards Emilio. It was something more complicated than that. It was the clear awareness that sometimes for things to really change, they have to hurt first, not out of sadism, but because pain is the only thing that breaks the anesthesia, and that house had been anesthetized for years. That afternoon, on my way back, I found Lorena in the kitchen. She was looking for something in the pantry with a frown, moving things around. She saw me come in and said nothing. Neither did I. I poured myself some water and leaned against the counter for a moment. Then she closed the pantry with more force than necessary and said, without looking at me, "Do you know Emilio didn't go to school today?" "Yes," I said, silence. "And you don't care?" I looked at her calmly. "I care a lot. That's why I'm reorganizing things." She turned to look at me with that expression I knew so well, that mix of indignation and confusion that appeared when things didn't go her way. "I don't understand what you're doing," she said. "I know," I replied and went to the living room. I heard her exhale sharply behind me, but she didn't follow me. She wasn't ready for that conversation yet. She was still in the not understanding stage. It wouldn't be long before she moved on to the next one, which was understanding all too well. That week, the atmosphere in the house changed noticeably. There was a tension that hung in the air like something nobody wanted to name. Raquel would come home from work and be quiet, distracted, with her phone in her hand, checking things. Emilio spent his days in his room or in the living room staring at the ceiling. Lorena was irritable, more than usual, as if the uncomfortable atmosphere was weighing on her, and she didn't know where to direct her annoyance. I remained the same. I'd arrive, eat, sleep, work without altering my rhythm, without showing signs of anguish or regret, without offering solutions that nobody had respectfully asked for. On Thursday of that week, another notice arrived. This one wasn't from the school. It was from the insurance company. Raquel received an email informing her that the family health plan was in the process of being canceled and that coverage would end in 17 days. The email detailed the coverages that would be lost and offered options to purchase a new plan individually. Raquel waited up for me that night. When I entered the room, she was sitting on the bed with her phone in her hand and an expression that wasn't exactly anger. It was something more like fear. A fear that still wanted to disguise itself as anger, but couldn't quite manage it. She showed me the email without saying a word. I read it, although I already knew exactly what it said. "Did you do this?" she asked me. "Yes, the whole family's health insurance." "Yes, Joel." Her voice broke slightly on that single word. "Joel, I have a doctor's appointment next month. Lorena takes medication." "Emilio, I know," I said. Then, "How could you, Raquel?" I interrupted her calmly, without raising my voice. "How much does a health plan for 3 people cost?" Silence. "You know," I asked. She didn't answer. "50 a month. That's what I've paid every month for the last 6 years." Silently, without anyone asking, without anyone thanking, without anyone even knowing the exact number. Raquel looked at me with her eyes shining. "That's not counting the mortgage." I continued. "Not counting Emilio's school, not counting the financing for the car your daughter uses every day, not counting the electricity, the water, the internet, the maintenance of this house." I paused. "How much does all that add up to, Raquel?" She said nothing, but I saw in her face the exact moment when the numbers started to line up in her head. That moment when the reality you've ignored for too long becomes impossible to keep ignoring. "I didn't know you were this upset," she finally said in a low voice. "I'm not upset," I replied. "I'm clear." "What's the difference?" "The difference is that when you're upset, you want to vent. When you're clear, you make decisions." She was silent for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said with a very small voice, "Are you going to leave us?" I looked at her, and for the first time in many days, I felt something that wasn't coldness. It was a flash of something warmer, older, more complicated, because behind that question was a woman who, underneath everything, underneath the mistakes and the silences and the laugh of that damned Sunday, was still the person I had decided to build something with. But she was also the person who had laughed. "I don't know yet," I told her, and it was the most honest answer I could give. That night we both slept, but in that way you sleep when there are too many unresolved things floating in the air of the room. A light, interrupted sleep that doesn't fully rest. The next morning, early, before anyone came down, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and reviewed my notes. Everything was still in order. Everything was still moving forward exactly as I'd planned. The most important part was missing. The part that was going to make everything completely clear. Not just for Raquel. For everyone. The bank had sent a routine notice about the mortgage the previous week, a payment date reminder. Nothing unusual. But I had replied to that notice requesting a face-to-face meeting with the advisor who handled my account. I told him I had important changes in my situation that I wanted to discuss in person. They gave me an appointment for the following Monday. That meeting was going to be the moment when everything that had been invisible would become completely visible. And I wanted Raquel to be present. Not to humiliate her, not for revenge, but because the time had come for the numbers to speak for themselves, without intermediaries, without softened versions, without the protection I had always placed between reality and her. It was time for reality to speak directly in reality. When it speaks without filters, has no compassion. The weekend before the appointment with the bank was the most tense I had experienced in that house in a long time, not because there were shouts or open arguments, but for the opposite reason. Because the silence that floated between the rooms was the kind that weighs, the kind that everyone feels, but no one wants to name first. Raquel was different. I noticed it since Saturday morning. She was quieter, more observant. as if she had suddenly started to look at the house with different eyes. I saw her standing in the living room for a moment, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the furniture, as if taking an inventory she had never needed to take before, as if seeing for the first time what had always been there, but that she had never had to consider hers in a real, concrete way, with a price and a responsibility. I didn't say anything to her. I let her look. Lorena, that Saturday, didn't go out all day. That was unusual. Normally on weekends, she would take the car and disappear until the evening. But that day she stayed home, moving from her room to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the living room, with the energy of someone who wants to do something but doesn't know exactly what. At some point, I saw her peeking through the window at where the car was parked, as if checking that it was still there. It was still there. For now, Emilio spent the weekend studying, or at least that's what it seemed like. He had spoken with Raquel and understood that the problem with the school was not yet resolved, that it depended on things that were out of his control. I saw him for a moment in the kitchen, and he had that expression of young people when they discover that the world doesn't work exactly as they thought. That mix of confusion and something like forced maturity made me feel a bit sorry. But the pity didn't change what had to happen. On Sunday afternoon, when the light began to fade and the house was quieter, Raquel approached where I was reading in the living room. She sat in front of me, not next to me, but in front of me, like someone who comes to have a real conversation. I turned down the volume on nothing because there was nothing playing. It was just the silence between us, and I looked at her. "I have a day off tomorrow," she said. "Can I go with you to the bank?" I looked at her for a moment. There was something in that question that surprised me, not because it was unexpected. In fact, I had planned it, but because of the way she asked it. Without demand, without manipulation. With a humility that Raquel rarely used, and that when it appeared still moved something inside me. "Yes," I said, "you can come." She nodded slowly, sat for a moment longer, as if she wanted to say something else, and then got up and went to the kitchen. That night the four of us had dinner at the table. It was strange, not because it was tense, but because it was almost normal. Raquel had cooked, something she did less and less often. Emilio talked a little about something he had seen on the internet. Lorena ate without bothering anyone, and I was present calmly, without pretending everything was fine, but also without feeding the discomfort. There was a moment near the end of dinner when Lorena looked at me. It wasn't a long look, it was barely a second, but in that second I saw something I hadn't seen in her before. It wasn't regret. She hadn't gotten to that yet. It was something more primitive. It was the discomfort of someone who begins to suspect that the floor they're walking on isn't as firm as they thought. I collected my plate, washed it, and went to my room. Monday dawned with low clouds and a discreet chill. I dressed calmly. Formal suit, not over the top, but formal. The kind of clothes you wear when you're going to have an important conversation and you want your presence to communicate something before you start talking. Raquel also dressed with more care than usual. I saw her choosing between two blouses, something she normally did quickly, and that told me she was nervous, even if she didn't say it. We left without waking the others. The drive to the bank was almost silent. Raquel looked out the window. I drove without rushing, taking the usual route, as if it were any other day of errands. The advisor who attended to me was named Bruno. I had known him for years, since I had opened the main account and then processed the mortgage. He was a methodical, kind man, without being effusive, one of those who inspire confidence. Not because of what they say, but because of how they organize information. He showed us into a small room, offered us water, and sat in front of us with a thin folder on the table. He looked at me first, then at Raquel, and then back at me. I told him he could speak with complete freedom, that my wife was there to understand the whole situation. Bruno nodded and began. He explained the current status of the mortgage, how much had been paid, how much was left, what the terms of the contract were. He spoke with clear numbers, without beating around the bush. And every time he mentioned the holder, the one responsible for the credit, the one who had signed and whom the bank legally recognized as the owner of that obligation, he used my name, only my name. Raquel listened with her hands clasped on the table, without interrupting, still in a way that wasn't her usual way of being still. It was the stillness of someone who is processing information that changes their perspective on something they thought they knew. Then Bruno mentioned, because I had asked him to in the previous email, the options available in case the holder decided to make changes to the contract. What happened if the holder wanted to get out of the agreement? What options did the property have in that case? What was the legal process? What were the timelines? Every word landed on the table between Raquel and me like something concrete. Heavy real. When Bruno finished his explanation, there was a brief silence. Then Raquel asked with a controlled voice, but barely, if she could take over the mortgage in her name in case I decided to get out of the contract. Bruno looked at her with professional kindness and told her that would depend on a new credit evaluation, that she would have to apply as a holder and meet the bank's requirements. That the process took time and there was no guarantee of approval. How much time? Raquel asked. Between 60 and 90 days for the complete evaluation, said Bruno. And that's if all the documentation is in order from start. Raquel nodded slowly, very slowly. We left the bank 20 minutes later. The morning chill was still there, maybe a little more intense. We walked to the car in silence. I sat at the wheel and didn't start the engine right away. I stayed for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. Looking ahead, Raquel was next to me with her purse on her lap, also looking forward without seeing anything in particular. Then she said something I didn't forget. She said with a voice that sounded smaller than I had heard from her in years, I didn't know everything was like this. I looked at her. What part didn't you know? I asked without harshness, genuinely. She took a while to answer. No part. She finally said, I didn't know any part. And there was the truth that we had both been carrying in different ways for 8 years. She without knowing, me knowing too much, and both of us for different reasons. Having never had this conversation with this clarity. Why did you never tell me? She asked. Because you never asked, I replied, and I never demanded it. We both settled into a system that was comfortable for you and that gradually emptied me. Silence. I didn't know that, she said. I know, I replied, but now you do. I started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot slowly, and as I drove back, with Raquel's silence next to me, I thought that something had happened that morning that couldn't be reversed. Not a fight, not a dramatic breakup. Something more definitive than that. The truth had entered that house in a way that could no longer be ignored, and what came next depended on what each person decided to do with it. But that was still to be seen. That afternoon, when we returned the bank, the house was silent. Lorena had gone out. Emilio was upstairs. Raquel came in, left her purse on the usual chair, and stood in the kitchen for a moment looking at the space as if it were the first time she was seeing it. I poured myself some water, leaned on the counter, and watched her without saying anything. There was something different about her since we left the bank. It was hard to name exactly. It wasn't sadness. Not yet. It was something more like that moment when you realize that the map you had in your head doesn't correspond to the real territory, that the distances are different, that the roads don't go where you thought. She sat at the kitchen table, placed her hands flat on the surface, as if she needed to feel something solid underneath. I need to understand something, she said without looking at me. I approached and sat in front of her. Have you decided to leave? She asked. I looked at her for a moment before answering. I haven't decided anything definitive yet. What I have decided is to stop supporting things in silence while being treated as if I don't exist. She raised her eyes to me. And Lorena, is this because of what Lorena said? Lorena was the last link. I said, but this chain comes from long before. Raquel pressed her lips together. I saw she wanted to defend herself, that there was something she wanted to say and was choosing how. Finally, she said, I'm not Lorena. No, I said, but you laughed. That sentence fell between us like something that couldn't be picked up. Raquel closed her eyes for a second, opened them again. It was a moment, she said. It was a stupid second. Yes, I replied. And that second told me more than you had told me in 8 years. Long silence. The kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable because there's nothing that filling it would relieve. What do you want me to do? She finally asked. I don't want you to do anything because I ask you to, I said. That doesn't work. What works is what you decide to do when you truly understand what happened. She thought about that. She nodded very slowly, almost to herself. I got up, washed my glass, and went upstairs to the room. That night, Lorena came back late. I heard her come in, move around the kitchen, go up the stairs, and before she reached her room, I heard her knock on Raquel's room door. Low voices. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the tone said it all. It wasn't the usual casual conversation. It was something more urgent, more tense, more real. I lay still in the darkness, listening without listening, and I thought that the moment that was unfolding in that hallway was exactly what had to happen. Raquel and Lorena finally facing together a reality that they had both ignored for too long. I didn't feel satisfaction in that. I felt something more neutral, something like confirmation that things were going exactly as they should. The next morning, Lorena came down earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen with my coffee when she appeared at the door. She stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. It wasn't the usual defiance. It wasn't the usual arrogance. It was something more complicated. She poured herself a coffee, sat at the counter, not at the table, at the counter, at a certain distance, as if measuring the space she needed. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, without looking at me, "My mom told me about the bank." I didn't answer. "I waited, and about Emilio's school," she continued, "and about the insurance." I kept waiting. Then she looked at me, and in that look there was something I had a hard time seeing, because I hadn't seen it from her for years. It was genuine discomfort. Not the discomfort of someone who is annoyed because things aren't going their way, but the discomfort of someone who is starting to see themselves from the outside and doesn't completely like what they see. "Is the car also in your name?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She processed that in silence. "How much is left to pay on it?" 18 months. She nodded slowly, looking at her coffee. There was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and then Lorena did something I didn't expect. She didn't apologize. She hadn't gotten to that yet. But she said with a voice lower than her usual tone, "I didn't know everything was in your name." "I know," I said. "That doesn't excuse what I said," she added almost in a whisper, as if it were hard for her to pronounce those words. I looked at her. It was the first time in 8 years that Lorena had said something like that. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't the conversation we might need to have someday. But it was the first brick of something that until that moment had been a solid wall. "No," I said, "it doesn't excuse it." Silence. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm still deciding," I replied. She nodded, finished her coffee, washed the cup, and left the kitchen without another word. I heard her grab the car keys from the drawer at the entrance, the same keys to the car I paid for every month. And I heard her leave. I was left alone in the kitchen with my coffee in my hand, listening to the sound of the engine fading away. That week was different from the previous ones. The tension was still there, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer the tension of something about to explode. It was the tension of something that had already exploded, and now everyone was looking at the pieces on the floor, trying to understand what happened and what's next. Raquel started doing things she didn't do before. Small things. She checked the outstanding house bills. She asked me exactly how much the mortgage was and on what date the month's payment was due. She asked for the name of the insurance company to contact them directly. She asked me concrete, practical things with numbers, with dates. It was the first time in 8 years that Raquel had asked me those things. I don't know if she was doing it because she was genuinely waking up to reality or because fear was moving her. It was probably both at the same time, and that was probably the most honest she could be at that moment. Emilio went back to school on Wednesday. Raquel had spoken with the administration and had made a partial payment with what she had to keep his spot while the situation was resolved. 0-0 that Raquel didn't have readily available, but that she got somehow that she didn't explain and that I didn't ask. When I found that out, I felt something. I'm not sure what exactly. Maybe it was recognition. Raquel had solved something on her own without asking me to solve it, without waiting for me to show up with the solution. She had done it with what she had, in the way she could, and she had done it. It was little, it was late, but it was something. On Thursday of that week, I got a message from my brother. I had finally told him what was happening in a long call we had on Tuesday night when Raquel was already asleep. He listened without interrupting much, which was his way. And At the end, he said something simple that kept turning over in my head. He said, "Joel, you can forgive someone and still not go back to the same place. The two things can exist at the same time." I thought about that for days because there was something in that sentence that touched exactly what I was feeling without being able to name it. I didn't carry hatred towards Raquel. I didn't carry hatred towards Lorena. What I carried was the clarity that some things, once seen, cannot be unseen, and that going back to a place where you were invisible isn't forgiving, it's erasing yourself again. And I had decided I wasn't going to erase myself anymore. On Friday afternoon, Raquel sought me out in the room. She entered, closed the door, and stood near the bed. Her eyes were red, not from crying at that moment, but from having cried before alone at some point during the day that I hadn't seen. She looked at me and said, "I know I did wrong. I know I've been doing wrong for a long time, and I know that one sorry isn't enough for all this." I looked at her in silence. "But I'm telling you anyway," she continued. "I'm sorry, Joel. I'm truly sorry." There was a long moment between those words and what came next. A moment in which we both looked at each other without saying anything, with the full weight of 8 years suspended in the air between us. And then I said the only thing that was true at that moment. "I know, Raquel, but I'm sorry isn't enough to decide what's next. What decides what's next are actions, and that's still to be seen." She nodded, said nothing more, and neither did I. The weeks that followed were the strangest I had ever lived in that house. Strange, not because they were chaotic, but because they were too conscious. Like when you know you're in the last days of something, and every moment has a different weight, a different texture. The conversations were more careful. The silences were more honest, and I moved through those spaces with the clarity of someone who already knows what they're going to do, but is still letting the process finish maturing. Raquel had changed, not completely, not overnight. That's not how real people work. But she had changed in concrete and visible ways. She would come home from work and ask if there was anything to do in the house. She reviewed the bills without me asking her to. One afternoon, I found her in the kitchen making a list of monthly expenses with a calculator on the side and the frown of someone who is seeing numbers they had never wanted to see head on. I approached, looked at the list over her shoulder without saying anything, and walked on. Lorena had also changed, although in a way that was harder to name. She was quieter, less invasive. She stopped treating me as if I were a piece of furniture in a room that belonged to her. She didn't talk to me much, but when she did, it was different, without the edge of before, without that constant need to remind me that I was the stranger, the one who was out of place, the one who was just passing through. One afternoon, without it coming from any particular conversation, she told me the car needed an oil change. She told me in an almost neutral way, like informing, without demanding, without assuming I would automatically solve it. I told her to take it to the usual workshop, that I would call to let them know. She said thanks. It was the first time in 8 years that Lorena had said thanks to me for something. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just nodded and went on with what I was doing. But I kept it. I kept it because it was important not to use it against anyone, but because it was a sign that people can move when reality gives them enough reasons to do so. Emilio was fine. He had gone back to school, had gotten back in his rhythm, and on a couple of occasions had sat with me in the living room to watch something on TV for no special reason. Like we used to before everything got tense. We didn't talk about what had happened. It wasn't necessary. Emilio was young and processed things in his own way. But I could see that something had changed in how he looked at me with more attention, with something more like recognition. That stage of the story could have ended there. It could have been the moment I decided to stay, when things rearranged themselves, when we built something new on the ruins of what had broken. And a part of me, the part that still remembered why I had chosen Raquel, why I had bet on that family, wanted that to be the end. But there was another part, a colder, more honest part, that knew that the changes of the last few weeks had come from fear and not from awareness. That Raquel had woken up because the consequences had shaken her, not because she had come to the conclusion on her own that something was wrong. That Lorena had softened her attitude because the ground had shifted under her feet, not because she had had a genuine revelation about the damage she had done. And that difference mattered. It mattered a lot because I had learned at 47 that people change in two ways. They change when they want to change from within, from their own decision, or they change when they have no other choice. And changes of the second type last exactly as long as the pressure that caused them. As soon as the pressure disappears, people go back to being who they were. I didn't want to live the rest of my life being the pressure that kept everyone at their best. I wanted to be the person someone chose to be with because they wanted to be, not because they needed the mortgage paid. I took that distinction to a Saturday night when Raquel and I were alone at home. Lorena was out, so was Emilio. We had dinner together, something simple she had prepared, and we stayed at the table after eating with our glasses half full and the low kitchen light, creating an atmosphere that at another time would have been romantic. Raquel looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of important conversations she had always avoided, and that now, in recent weeks, she was learning not to dodge. "What are you thinking?" she asked me. I told her everything I had been thinking in those weeks, not with anger, not with calculated coldness, but with the quiet honesty of someone who has nothing to lose by telling the truth. I talked about the 8 years, about the invisibility, about what that Sunday at the table meant to me, about the laugh, the silence, about the way I had gradually disappeared inside that house without anyone noticing, because I was too useful for my absence to be convenient. Raquel listened to me without interrupting, with her eyes fixed on me, with her hands still on the table, and when I finished she took a moment to speak. "You're right about everything," she said, "and I don't know how to ask you to stay after having given you so few reasons to do so." I looked at her. "But I'm asking you," she continued. "Not because I need you to pay the mortgage. I'm asking you because I love you. Because I know that what we have underneath everything that broke is still worth something." There was a silence between us that lasted long enough to be honest. "And Lorena?" I asked. Raquel didn't dodge that question as she would have months ago. I spoke with her. I really spoke with her, Joel. Not in the way I always did to calm things down. I told her what she did. I told her what that Sunday meant, and I told her that if she wanted to continue being part of this family, she had to do things differently. And what did she say? That she was going to try? I nodded slowly. I didn't take it as a guarantee, but I took it as a real first step, which was more than there had been before. I didn't make any final decision that night. I went to sleep with all of that inside, processing it slowly, as I had learned to process important things, without rush, without drama. But the next morning, I did something I hadn't done since that first Monday when I canceled the automatic payments. I went into the bank's app and reactivated the charge for Emilio's school. Just that one, just for that month. Not as a sign that everything was resolved, but as a sign that I was a man who made decisions from clarity and not from pain. Then I called the lawyer. I thanked him that for the moment I wouldn't need to proceed with any formal process, that things were at a different point than weeks ago. He told me he understood, that he knew where to find me if anything changed. I hung up. I stayed for a moment with the phone in my hand, looking out my office window at the sky that morning, still cloudy, but with some light breaking through on one side. I thought about everything that had happened since that Sunday, about the keys on the table, about the silence at the bank, about Raquel's face when the numbers fell on their own without me having to explain anything, about Lorena's voice telling me thank you for the first time in Emilio going back to school in the nights. I stayed awake, counting what I supported and what I deserved, and I thought that sometimes the most important things aren't resolved with a grand final gesture. They're resolved in small, constant decisions, made from the awareness of what you're worth and what you deserve. I knew what I was worth. Now they knew it too. And what came next, whatever came next, was going to be built on that foundation, or it wasn't going to be built at all. That was the only condition I had left, and that condition was non-negotiable. There's one thing no one tells you about the moments that change your life. They don't arrive with dramatic music, or with rain on the window, or with perfect phrases you rehearsed before. They arrive on ordinary Tuesdays with coffee cooling on the table, with the sound of the street outside, with the same light coming in through the same window as always. They arrive disguised as nothing, and yet they change everything. My Tuesday arrived 3 weeks after that night Raquel asked me to stay. I had been observing, not with suspicion, not like someone spying for reasons to leave, but with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that words weigh less than actions, and that time is the only judge that doesn't lie. I was watching to see if what had started to move in that house was still moving when the pressure eased, when the bills started getting paid again, when comfort slowly returned. And what I saw in those 3 weeks was enough to make the most important decision I had made in a long time. Raquel had continued to do things differently, not perfectly, not miraculously transformed, but different in the concrete, everyday way that people change when the change is real. She had started managing her own expenses with an attention she didn't have before. She had had conversations with Lorena that I didn't hear completely, but whose effects I noticed. She had stopped treating the house like a system that ran on its own and had started to ask, to participate, to be present in a way she wasn't before. It wasn't enough to erase 8 years. Nothing was, but it was real. And what's real, even if it's small, weighs more than what's perfect but doesn't exist. Lorena had had a moment with her alone. I knew because Raquel told me that same night. They had sat in the living room, the two of them, without Emilio, without anyone else. And Lorena had said things that Raquel repeated to me with her eyes shining, that she knew she had gone too far, that she knew what she said, that Sunday was unfair, that it wasn't easy for her to admit it, but she admitted it. She hadn't said it to me directly yet, but she had said it, and that counted too. Emilio was still in school, still in his rhythm, and one afternoon, he asked me if I could help him understand something in math for a test. I sat with him for an hour at the kitchen table, with the notebooks open between us, explaining something that had been hard for me to understand at his age too. And at some point during that hour, without it coming from anywhere in particular, I realized that this simple, drama-free moment was exactly the kind of thing for which I had decided to stay in that house 8 years ago. Not the mortgage, not the numbers, but the chance to be useful in a way that had no price. That Tuesday, when everything definitively settled, came just like that. I was in the kitchen finishing my coffee before leaving for work. Raquel came down, poured hers, and leaned on the counter in front of me. She didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me in that way she had learned to have in recent weeks, a more direct, less evasive look, like someone who is no longer so afraid of what they might find if they look head-on. Then she took an envelope from the drawer and put it on the counter between us. I looked at it. It was an envelope from the bank. I opened it yesterday. She said, I wanted to understand it myself before showing it to you. I opened it. It was a statement, the one for the mortgage, with the movements of the last year, the payments made, the outstanding balance, everything in my name, everything with my signature, everything with my history. I read it slowly, although I already knew every number by heart. Then I raised my eyes to her. I want us to put the house in both our names, said Raquel. I want it to be ours really, not just in practice, but on paper. I looked at her in silence. I spoke to someone at the bank. She continued. They explained the process. It's possible to add me as a co-owner if you agree and if I qualify. They're going to review my finances, but they told me that with my current history, there's a good chance. I kept looking at her. I'm not asking you this so you feel obligated to stay, she said. I'm asking you because it's the right thing to do. Because if we're going to build something here, it has to be for both of us, not yours that you lend me. There was a silence between that sentence and my answer that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Okay, I said. Raquel let out her breath slowly, as if she had been holding it without realizing. Okay, I repeated. We'll do it. It wasn't a moment of hugs or tears or background music. It was a quiet moment of the kind that doesn't need embellishments because what it contains is already enough. Two people in a kitchen with coffee in hand, deciding that what they had built was worth the work of rebuilding it on more honest foundations. That week I called the lawyer again, not to start a separation process, but to ask him about the process of adding a co-owner to a property. He explained the steps, the documents, the timelines. It was a real process with real procedures that was going to take between 45 and 60 days. Nothing instant, nothing symbolic, just something concrete. That's what I needed. The concrete. I reactivated the health plan that same week. I called the insurance company, explained that there had been a change in situation. I asked if it was possible to reverse the cancellation before the deadline expired. They said yes, that with enough notice it was possible. I did it without drama, without announcing it at home as a heroic gesture. I just did it. Lorena knew the insurance was still active when she went to pick up a prescription for her medication, and the coverage worked without a problem. That afternoon, she came home, saw me in the living room, and stopped for a moment at the door. She looked at me and said with a voice that was clearly difficult for her, but that came out anyway. "Thanks, Joel." 2 words, the same 2 words she had said weeks before for the car. But this time they were different. This time they weren't just courtesy, they were recognition. And recognition, when it comes from someone who has denied it for years, has a weight unlike anything else. "You're welcome," I said, and continued reading. I did nothing more than that. I didn't extend the moment. I didn't look for more than what was there, because I learned something important in all those months, that dignity doesn't need an audience, that the moments that really matter don't require anyone to applaud them, or record them, or celebrate them out loud. They just happen, and you keep them in the exact place where they should be. Today, as I tell all this, several months have passed since that Sunday when I put the keys on the table in front of everyone. The house is still the same house, the table is still the same table, but the people who sit around it are, in important and concrete ways, different, not perfect, never perfect, but different. Raquel and I are still together. We're still building slowly, with more honesty than we had before. There are easy days and days that are hard, but the difference is that now we both know what the other is carrying, and that changes the way you walk alongside someone. Lorena still lives at home working, using the car that is still financed in my name for 11 more months. But there's something that changed between us that doesn't have an exact name, but that is felt in the way we move in the same space. I'm no longer the intruder. I'm not the favorite either. I'm something more honest than both things. I'm the man who is there with a history, with weight, with a real presence. Emilio passed his exams. He told me himself, with his way of not making a big fuss about good things. I told him well done. He smiled and went up to his room. And I was left thinking about everything I had learned in this time. I learned that respect isn't begged for, that when you ask for it with words and it doesn't come, you have to ask for it in another way, with actions, consequences, with the courage to stop supporting what crushes you, even if it's for a while, even if it hurts, even if no one understands. At first, I learned that one silence can be more powerful than all the screams in the world, if that silence is backed by real decisions. I learned that giving excessively without setting limits isn't generosity. It's a contract that no one signed, but that you end up paying for alone. And I learned above all that it's never too late to stand in the center of your own life and say calmly, without drama, without hatred, this far and no further. And then decide what comes next from that place, not from pain, not from anger, but from the clarity of someone who knows what they're worth and isn't willing to forget it again. If anything I've told today resonates with you, if you recognize something of this story in your own life, I want you to know one thing. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to break yourself to be valued. Sometimes it's enough to stop supporting what weighs you down, take a step back, and let reality speak for itself. It always does. It just needs space to arrive. And have you ever had to stop giving for someone to understand what you were really doing? Tell me in the comments, because these stories don't end when I stop talking. They end when you recognize something of yours in them.